Charles X was King of France from the 16th of September 1824 until the 2nd of August 1830. For most of his life he was known as the Count of Artois, an uncle of the uncrowned King Louis XVII, and younger brother to reigning kings Louis XVI and Louis XVIII. He supported the latter in exile and eventually succeeded him. His rule of almost 6 years ended in the July Revolution of 1830, which resulted in his abdication and the election of Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, as King of the French. Exiled once again, Charles died in 1836 in Gorizia, then part of the Austrian Empire. He was the last of the French rulers from the senior branch of the House of Bourbon. Childhood and adolescence. Charles Philippe of France was born in 1757, the youngest son of the Dauphin, Louis, and his wife, the Dauphine Marie-Josepha, at the Palace of Versailles. Charles was created Count of Artois at birth by his grandfather, the reigning King Louis XV. As the youngest male in the family, Charles seemed unlikely ever to become king. His eldest brother, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, died unexpectedly in 1761, which moved Charles up one place in the line of succession. He was raised in early childhood by Madame de Marsan, the governess of the children of France. At the death of his father in 1765, Charles's oldest surviving brother, Louis Auguste, became the new Dauphin. Their mother Marie-Josepha, who never recovered from the loss of her husband, died in March 1767 from tuberculosis. Louis XV fell ill on the 27th of April 1774 and died on the 10th of May of smallpox at the age of 64. His grandson Louis Auguste succeeded him as King Louis XVI of France. Marriage and private life. In November 1773, Charles married Marie-Thérèse of Savoy. The marriage, unlike that of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, was consummated almost immediately. In 1775, Marie-Thérèse gave birth to a boy, Louis Antoine, who was created Duke of Angoulême by Louis XVI. Louis Antoine was the first of the next generation of Bourbons, as the King and the Count of Provence had not fathered any children yet, causing the Parisian libellists to lampoon Louis XVI's alleged impotence. 3 years later, in 1778, Charles's second son, Charles Ferdinand, was born and given the title of Duke of Berry. In the same year, Queen Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child, Marie-Thérèse, quelling all rumors that she could not bear children. Charles was thought of as the most attractive member of his family, bearing a strong resemblance to his grandfather Louis XV. His wife was considered quite ugly by most contemporaries, and he looked for company in numerous extramarital affairs. According to the Count of Essex, few beauties were cruel to him. Later, he embarked upon a lifelong love affair with the beautiful Louise de Palastrin, the sister-in-law of Marie Antoinette's closest companion, the Duchess of Polignac. Charles also struck up a firm friendship with Marie Antoinette herself, whom he had first met upon her arrival in France in April 1770 when he was 12. The closeness of the relationship was such that he was falsely accused by Parisian rumor-mongers of having seduced her. As part of Marie Antoinette's social set, Charles often appeared opposite her in the private theatre of her favorite royal retreat, the Petit Trianon. They were both said to be very talented amateur actors. Marie Antoinette played milkmaids, shepherdesses, and country ladies, whereas Charles played lovers, valets, and farmers. A famous story concerning the two involves the construction of the Château de Bagatelle. In 1775, Charles purchased a small hunting lodge in the Bois de Boulogne. He soon had the existing house torn down with plans to rebuild. Marie Antoinette wagered her brother-in-law that the new chateau could not be completed within 3 months. Charles engaged the neoclassical architect François-Joseph Bellanger to design the building. He won his bet, with Bellanger completing the house in 63 days. It is estimated that the project, which came to include manicured gardens, cost over 2 million livres. Throughout the 1770s, Charles spent lavishly. He accumulated enormous debts, totaling 21 million livres. In the 1780s, King Louis XVI paid off the debts of both his brothers, the Counts of Provence and Artois. In 1781, Charles acted as a proxy for Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II at the christening of his godson, the Dauphin Louis Joseph. Crisis and French Revolution. Charles's political awakening started with the first great crisis of the monarchy in 1786, when it became apparent that the kingdom was bankrupt from previous military endeavors and needed fiscal reform to survive. Charles supported the removal of the aristocracy's financial privileges, but was opposed to any reduction in the social privileges enjoyed by either the church or the nobility. He believed that France's finances should be reformed without the monarchy being overthrown. In his own words, it was time for repair, not demolition. King Louis XVI eventually convened the Estates General, which had not been assembled for over 150 years, to meet in May 1789 to ratify financial reforms, along with his sister Elizabeth. Charles was the most conservative member of the family and opposed the demands of the Third Estate to increase their voting power. This prompted criticism from his brother, who accused him of being plus royaliste que le roi. In June 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves a National Assembly intent on providing France with a new constitution. In conjunction with the Baron de Breteuil, Charles had political alliances arranged to depose the Liberal Minister of Finance, Jacques Necker. These plans backfired when Charles attempted to secure Necker's dismissal on the 11th of July without Breteuil's knowledge, much earlier than they had originally intended. It was the beginning of a decline in his political alliance with Breteuil, which ended in mutual loathing. Necker's dismissal provoked the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July. At the insistence of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, Charles and his family left France 3 days later, on the 17th of July, along with several other courtiers, including the Duchess of Polignac, the Queen's favorite. His flight has historically been largely attributed to personal fears for his own safety. However, recent research indicates that the king approved in advance of his brother's departure, seeing it as a means of ensuring that one close relative would be free to act as a spokesman for the monarchy after Louis himself had been removed from Versailles to Paris. Life in exile. Charles and his family decided to seek refuge in Savoy, his wife's native country, where they were joined by some members of the Condé family. Meanwhile, in Paris, Louis XVI was struggling with the National Assembly, which was committed to radical reforms and had enacted the Constitution of 1791. In March 1791, the Assembly also enacted a Regency Bill that provided for the case of the king's premature death. While his heir Louis Charles was still a minor, the Count of Provence, the Duke of Orleans, or, if either was unavailable, someone chosen by election should become regent, completely passing over the rights of Charles who, in the royal lineage, stood between the Count of Provence and the Duke of Orleans. Charles meanwhile left Turin and moved to Trier, where his uncle, Clemens Wenceslaus of Saxony, was the incumbent archbishop-elector. Charles prepared for a counter-revolutionary invasion of France, but a letter by Marie Antoinette postponed it until after the royal family had escaped from Paris and joined a concentration of regular troops under General de Bouillé at Montmedy. After the attempted flight was stopped at Varennes, Charles moved on to Koblenz, where he, the recently escaped Count of Provence and the Princes of Condé jointly declared their intention to invade France. The Count of Provence was sending dispatches to various European sovereigns for assistance, while Charles set up a court in exile in the electorate of Trier. On the 25th of August, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which called on other European powers to intervene in France. On New Year's Day 1792, the National Assembly declared all emigrants traitors, repudiated their titles and confiscated their lands. This measure was followed by the suspension and eventually, the abolition of the monarchy in September 1792. The royal family was imprisoned and the king and queen were eventually put to death in 1793. The young Dauphin died of illnesses and neglect in 1795. When the French Revolutionary Wars broke out in 1792, Charles escaped to Great Britain, where King George III of Great Britain gave him a generous allowance. Charles lived in Edinburgh and London with his mistress Louise de Polastre and his older brother, dubbed Louis XVIII after the death of his nephew in June 1795, relocated to Verona and then to Jelgava Palace, Mitau, where Charles's son Louis-Antoine married Louis XVI's only surviving child, Marie-Thérèse, on 10 June 1799. In 1802, Charles supported his brother with several £1,000s. In 1807, Louis XVIII moved to Great Britain. The Bourbon Restoration. In January 1814, Charles covertly left his home in London to join the coalition forces in southern France. Louis XVIII, by then wheelchair-bound, supplied Charles with letters patent creating him Lieutenant General of the kingdom. On 31 March, the Allies captured Paris. A week later, Napoleon I abdicated. The Senate declared Louis XVIII restored. Charles arrived in the capital on 12 April and acted as Lieutenant General of the kingdom until Louis XVIII arrived from England. During his brief tenure as regent, Charles created an ultra-royalist secret police that reported directly back to him without Louis XVIII's knowledge. It operated for over 5 years. Louis XVIII was greeted with great rejoicing from the Parisians and proceeded to occupy the Tuileries Palace. The Count of Artois lived in the Pavillon de Mars, and the Duke of Angoulême in the Pavillon de Flore, which overlooked the River Seine. The Duchess of Angoulême fainted upon arriving at the palace, as it brought back terrible memories of her family's incarceration there, and of the storming of the palace and the massacre of the Swiss guards on 10 August 1792. Following the advice of the occupying Allied army, Louis XVIII drafted a liberal constitution, the Charter of 1814, which entailed a bicameral legislature, an electorate of 90,000 men and freedom of religion. After the 100 Days, Napoleon's brief return to power in 1815, the White Terror focused mainly on the purging of a civilian administration which had almost completely turned against the Bourbon monarchy. About 70,000 officials were dismissed from their positions. The remnants of the Napoleonic army were disbanded after Waterloo and its senior officers cashiered. Marshal Ney was executed for treason, and Marshal Brune was murdered by a crowd. Approximately 6,000 individuals who had rallied to Napoleon were brought to trial. There were about 300 mob lynchings in the south of France, notably in Marseille where his Mamluks were massacred in their barracks. The king's brother and heir presumptive. While the king retained the liberal charter, Charles patronized members of the ultra-royalists in parliament, such as Jules de Polignac, the writer François-René de Chateaubriand and Jean-Baptiste de Villèle. On several occasions, Charles voiced his disapproval of his brother's liberal ministers and threatened to leave the country unless Louis XVIII dismissed them. Louis, in turn, feared that his brothers and heir presumptive's ultra-royalist tendencies would send the family into exile once more. On 14 February 1820, Charles's younger son, the Duke of Berry, was assassinated at the Paris Opera. This loss not only devastated the family but also put the continuation of the Bourbon dynasty in jeopardy, as the Duke of Angoulême's marriage had not produced any children. Parliament debated the abolition of the Salic law, which excluded females from the succession and was long held inviolable. However, the Duke of Berry's widow, Caroline of Naples and Sicily, was found to be pregnant and on 29 September 1820 gave birth to a son, Henry, Duke of Bordeaux. His birth was hailed as God-given, and the people of France bought for him the Château de Chambord in celebration of his birth. As a result, his granduncle, Louis XVIII, added the title Count of Chambord, hence Henry, Count of Chambord, the name by which he is usually known.